चिकन खाना है?
चिकन नहीं खाता। ये तो प्रॉब्लम।
अब बहुत है वेज बाहर।
Well, before we begin this conversation, where we'll be talking about the rediscovery of India's Buddhist heritage, a story in which travelers, all kinds of explorers, decipherers, I imagine even political figures, an artist figure. I think both of us would like to say that we deeply regret that one, literary artist, the celebrated author of Midnight's Children, could not be present in the Jaipur Literary Festival. I say this because our conversation is about rediscovering the Buddhist heritage, and many of you might remember that in Midnight's Children, the Buddha, works in one part as a kind of trope, where you have, in the context of the 1971 war, Salim actually sitting cross-legged under a tree in the Sundarbans, and he actually gets back his memory when he is bitten by a blind serpent. So, having said that, I want to say, John Keay, that it would be good to actually begin this conversation with how we met, bring in some personal history. It wasn't actually all that long ago. I would say sometime in August last year. This was in the Archaeological Survey of India Library, that organization whose 150th year is being celebrated from the date when Alexander Cunningham, the archaeological explorer par excellence, who mapped out a great deal of India's Buddhist heritage, actually was appointed by the British Raj as an archaeological surveyor. And I was sitting in this library looking at, the different journals of Alexander Cunningham, which lie in that library, which are full of these Buddhist stupas and sites, which figure in John Keay's books. John Keay was there because he came to research something specific as he was giving the finishing touches to his manuscript, which of course has now been published as a book to cherish and conserve. He's of course a celebrated author of many books, but this is his most recent work.
When I first met Nayanjot in the library of the Asiatic Society of the Archaeological Survey of India, I'd only that morning opened in Hindustan Times, and she'd written a piece claiming that, in fact, the Archaeological Survey had no right to be celebrating its 150th anniversary because it was only the 140th. That, in fact, the survey had been founded in 1871 and not 1861. So I was very, very intimidated to come across the author of this piece, who was actually probably doing me out of a job if it wasn't the 150th anniversary. But anyway, we did manage to solve that problem, in that the survey this year is celebrating its 150th anniversary, because it was in 1861 that the first archaeological surveys started, and the first printed reports began to appear from 1861. But the actual survey as an institution, as you'll learn later on, really only started in 1871, so 10 years later. I think probably the best thing is if I can tell you a little bit about the early years of the Archaeological Survey and about Alexander Cunningham, who started it, and then we'll have a discussion around it. I think I was invited to write this book for the Archaeological Survey on the strength of another book that I wrote about 30 years ago. It's called India Discovered. And it sometimes got confused with Pandit Nehru's great work on the discovery of India. which is probably why my book's still around. People confuse them. Since then, there have been books entitled India Revealed, India Rediscovered, and so on. All are about India's antiquity rather than its geography. India and the notion of discovery seem to go together. In fact, so much so that what we now know of India's ancient history may be said to be almost entirely the result of comparatively recent findings and revelations, most of them archaeological. Other nations rejoice in their documentational past. In the case of China, it stretches back to the 2nd millennium BC. Writing and preserving such records was something of a Chinese obsession. But it was not so in India. Before the Muslim invasions of the 11th to 13th centuries, Indian historical documentation was scarce, and what there was of it, very little has survived. Instead, the history of pre-modern India has had to be pieced together from the chance testimony of long-buried coins, from land grants recorded on copper plates, and above all from etched inscriptions in slabs of weather-worn stone and rock. In effect, the National Archives are not in that big red building in Jaipur in Delhi, but they lie embedded in the very bones of the country. Inscribed rocks and metals tell of India's ancient empires. Archaeological and architectural context helps to date these empires, and frescoes and sculptural reliefs have served to populate them. So to the painstaking exploration of monuments, buildings, artifacts, excavations, inscriptions, we owe almost everything that we know of what India once was. Some of the most important discoveries, like that of the great Harappan or Indus Valley civilization, were not in fact made until the 20th century. It should therefore come as no great surprise that 100 years earlier, nothing whatsoever was known about another great Indian civilization that we now take for granted, namely that based on Buddhism and its one-time prevalence in India. In the 19th century, there were no practicing Buddhists in sub-Himalayan South Asia, and there hadn't been for at least 500 years. No one could explain that the great stupas that dotted the Indian landscape from Bihar and the Punjab down to Amaravati in the south, no one knew actually what they were. Statuary depicting the Buddha was presumed to represent Lord Shiva or some other Hindu deity. It was not even certain that the Buddha, as worshipped in adjacent countries like China and Tibet and Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka and so on, that he was actually a historical figure. Many supposed him a supernatural deity or one of Lord Vishnu's many divine manifestations. That India was in fact the cradle of pre-Islamic Asia's most active and universal religion was not even guessed at. Now all this changed in the first half of the 19th century as a result of an extraordinary sequence of discoveries and some painstaking detection work. In effect, these discoveries provoked a surge of interest that might really be compared to the Renaissance in late medieval Europe. Nehru would draw on them to formulate an abiding sense of Indian nationalism, and post-partition India has made this distant past its own. It's no exaggeration to say that the breakthrough in Buddhist studies restored India's sense of historical distinction, authenticated its claims to a long classical antiquity, and gave birth to the study of this past, not least through the agency of the Archaeological Survey of India. In fact, the survey in its early years was effectively validated by these Buddhist discoveries. Nayanjot would call them its Buddhist obsessions, and itself became deeply involved in this rewriting of Indian history. Now, many of you will know this story, and those who don't, I don't want to spoil it. Read the book. But perhaps some context would help. Revisiting this subject, as I say, after 30 years, four things particularly intrigued me, and they were, in no particular order, the status of archaeology in British India as compared to that in Europe at the time, the crucial part played by Indian scholars, however poorly acknowledged in the interpretation of these discoveries, the enduring appeal and importance of the sites that they identified, and finally the extraordinary career of Alexander Cunningham, the founder and Director General of the ASI. So, taking each in turn, in an early 19th century, archaeology, as we now know it, scarcely existed. The dictionary defined archaeology simply as the study of the ancient, of the archaic. It was a branch of historical study involving texts and institutions quite as much as antiquities. Excavation, not just here but in Egypt or Greece, was largely for the purposes of extraction for unearthing and appropriating historical evidence. The sites themselves were more often pillaged than protected. A responsibility for conservation was barely acknowledged, and restoration was of course out of the question. In fact, those field workers who took a particular interest in ancient sites and collected ancient artifacts were not usually known as archaeologists at all, but as antiquarians. Antiquarians were not necessarily amateurs, though they're a far cry from what we think of as archaeologists today. In Europe, two literary giants, who also happened to be connoisseurs of romantic architecture, led the way. Sir Walter Scott in the English-speaking world and Prosper Mérimée in the French-speaking world. Both these men will be distantly instrumental in the founding of the Archaeological Survey of India. Prosper Mérimée directed a survey of historical monuments in France that was the first of its kind in Europe. This was in about the 1830s, and that provided the likely inspiration for Alexander Cunningham's survey in India. And Sir Walter Scott was, in fact, the Cunningham family's mentor, its inspiration, and indeed the patron of Alexander Cunningham. In India, too, antiquarians led the way. Of the pioneers directly involved in the rehabilitation of Buddhism, none of them came prepared for the task. For instance, Colin Mackenzie was a military surveyor and mathematician. Francis Buchanan was a naturalist. James Prinsep, the greatest of them all, was in fact a metallurgist. And Brian Hodgson was an eccentric recluse. Few of them understood a word of Sanskrit or any of the other languages used in ancient India. And their observations, Mackenzie's on the Amravati Stupa in Andhra, Buchanan's on the crucial site of Bodh Gaya in Bihar, and Hodgson's of Buddhist texts in Nepal, bore fruit only because of the enthusiastic support and the painstaking deciphering work undertaken by James Prinsep as Secretary of the Asiatic Society in Kolkata. In 1834, the 20-year-old Alexander Cunningham, another military engineer, joined this select band of pioneers and on his own initiative undertook the first excavation of the great Dhamek Stupa at Sana in Varanasi. Here and a host of other sites over the next 50 years, his work would later attract much criticism. But the point I want to make here is simply that at the time archaeology was itself in its infancy. Cunningham and his peers knew next to nothing about stratigraphy and barely understood the importance of site conservation. They saw their task as historical reconstruction, and they sought out those objects, especially inscriptions, that might provide clues to the chronology and extent of ancient empires and civilizations. India's heritage often suffered in the process, but as the recent authority puts it, even in respect of the early years of the ASI, India's record in protecting and preserving its monuments stands comparison with any country in the world. Only Mérimée France was ahead of India in this sense of responsibility for its cultural heritage. In Britain, an ancient Monuments Protection Act and the Royal Commission on Ancient Historical Monuments would not be set up until the 1880s, so 20 years after similar legislation and a similar institution had been set up in India. India was thus ahead of the field, way ahead of China and the rest of Asia, in taking cognizance of its heritage. As for the part played by Indians themselves in this process of historical reconstruction, I'm not going to say very much. Nayanjot has dealt with this in several books and papers, and is much better qualified to speak about it. But all those British, indeed mostly Scottish pioneers I mentioned, depended on the scholarship and linguistic skills of their depended on the scholarship and linguistic skills of their munchis, monks, brahmins, and other secretaries and babus in their employ. We know some of their names and specialities, but their contributions often went woefully unacknowledged. Imperialism, after all, was not exactly generous of heart, and 19th century archaeologists, like 19th century explorers, tended to be intensely jealous of their reputations and possessive about their discoveries. But suffice it to say that without the collaboration of countless Indian scholars, interpreting the finds and inscriptions would have been a hopeless task. More even than Nehru realized, the discovery of India, his book, as well as the actual process it describes, was the achievement of scholars born and educated in India. As for the great sites and monuments first brought to the world's attention by Prince F and his informants, and then by Cunningham at the head of the ASI, I need merely mention a few names. They speak for themselves. Ashoka's columns and rock inscriptions at various locations, the great Buddhist site at Sana, that at Sanchi, that at Bahut, that at Taxila, now in Pakistan, Bodh Gaya, of course. And then Cunningham also extended his activities way beyond Buddhism to study and record Islamic and Hindu architecture, and again Gwalior, Khajuraho, and the great Islamic and Mughal sites in Delhi, Agra and Lahore. All these places, many of which have since become World Heritage, UNESCO World Heritage sites, all of them really, and which are today the kind of must-see attractions of visitors to India, all of them were first really described and recorded in any detail by principally Cunningham and the Archaeological Survey of India in its early years. We could go on, but the point I want to stress is that all these sites, as I say, were recorded by Cunningham. And finally, there's Cunningham himself. If you've ever seen a photograph of him, he's immensely overweight. He has a kind of walrus moustache, and he looks very much like the retired British general that he was. But he retired early, age 47, after a career that had already taken him to Ladakh in the 1840s and to Burma throughout the Great Indian Rebellion of 1857, or the First War of Independence. So he missed that trauma, luckily, and of course both lands, Ladakh and Burma, were places where Buddhism still prevails, and it was this intimate experience of devotional Buddhism which informed his pleas to government for an archaeological survey directed towards India's Buddhist sites. At the same time, he was very fortunate to have copies of just translated itineraries of 3 Chinese monks who had visited India in the 5th to 7th centuries AD, and these provided a kind of key to the human geography of Buddhist India at that time. One work in particular, the journal of the 7th century monk Xuanzang, became what Cunningham called his Bible. His survey would be conducted in the footsteps of Xuanzang, whose distances and bearings and site identifications he accepted as gospel. As he doggedly followed in the footsteps of his 7th century precursor, it was a case of the Orientalist adopting the methods of the Orientalist. He'd retired from the army when his piece for a survey had finally been accepted in 1861. Immediately he adopted Prosper Mérimée practice of making annual tours to different parts of the country, first Bihar, then UP, then Punjab, Rajasthan, Central India, and so on. His 50th birthday came and went when he was still in the field, then his 60th, and then his 70th, well before the survey itself was institutionalized as a government department in 1871. Cunningham himself had become an institution. Eventually, in 1884, after 25 years in the field, a fall from his elephant brought his career to an end. The survey barely survived him. It soldiered on under James Burgess for a few years and then was wound down as its responsibilities were delegated to British India's provincial governments. Its revival and re-establishment with a vast increase in budget and personnel was the work of Lord Curzon at the turn of the century. As Viceroy from 1899, Curzon hailed India's built heritage as what he called the greatest galaxy of monuments in the world, and it was he who finally afforded to them the protection they deserved. As he told the Asiatic Society in the year 1900, "It is, in my opinion, equally our duty to dig and discover, to classify, reproduce and describe, to copy and decipher, and to cherish and conserve." Hence the title of this little book, To Cherish and Conserve. The reconstituted ASI under Curzon thus acquired a comprehensive brief and would soon be headed by genuine archaeologists of international stature, like the great John Marshall. But the honour of discovering this great galaxy of monuments and making people aware that India did indeed possess a heritage comparable with those of Greece or Rome, and essentially, or primarily indeed, Buddhist, belongs to Cunningham. And as I found when writing this book, it is through his crucial reports and other publications that the early years of the Archaeological Survey actually come to life. So that gives you a brief idea of what the book is about. As I say, the story of actually deciphering and discovering and reinstating Buddhism in India's ancient history is really too involved for me to go. I'd be speaking for hours if I went into it now. Buy the book.
You actually, mentioned a number of themes, and I was just thinking about the Buddhist passion,
Yes.
of Cunningham. And I was thinking that while, the discoveries that you have actually talked about, clearly shows that this really was very empowering. And that's why he discovered what he did. But simultaneously, it was limiting. If you look at Cunningham's work, I'm thinking, for example, of the famous site of Taxila. He was the one who gave literary Taxila a physical presence. He's the one who discovered it on the ground. But what was Cunningham interested in as far as Taxila was concerned? He was actually interested in the religious landscape of Taxila. So it is the stupas, the monasteries, the temples that he documented. And he was actually, looking for stupas even where there were none. There's, in his 1863 report, for example, this bit about him excavating a wall, thinking it's a stupa near what is called the Bhir Mound. And as soon as he found these large chunks of stone, and he realized that this is not a stupa, he lost interest. Yeah. So the point is that today when you think of Taxila, you think of its shops, and you think of the houses, and you think of the streets, and you think of what normal people use, the pots and the weapons and the tools and so on and so forth. And none of that actually, figures in the work of Cunningham. So, this idea of a vibrant, dynamic city somehow, gets marginalized because Cunningham is primarily interested in the Buddhist landscape of that city. Now, an even more dramatic example than that, John, is that of Harappa, which, you mentioned. By the time, Cunningham clearly, had a thing for Harappa. He only excavated Harappa on his third visit there, which was in the early 1870s. And he had a sense that he was looking at something he hadn't seen anywhere in India. Remember, by the 1870s, Cunningham has been here for many decades doing field work. But if you look at his report, and if you look at the plate, the illustrations that he provides, what is it that figure in that plate? There is pottery, there are flint tools, these long blades that are so typical today of the Indus civilization, and there's an inscribed seal. So, I would say this is very important because if you look at the Cunningham reports on the whole, you will find a lot of Buddhist sculpture, you will find inscriptions there, you will find architectural relics. But pottery and stone blades you will rarely see, you know. So he had a sense that this was something unique. But when it came to actually identifying Harappa, what is it that you find in Cunningham's work? He falls back, you know, on the journal that you mentioned. He actually identifies Harappa, which we recognize today as a 3rd millennium BC city. He considers this to be a place that Xuanzang visited, a place called Po Fa To Lo. And, you know, Xuanzang is supposed to have spent 2 months there. And he actually tries to then identify, you know, monasteries and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, the Chinese pilgrim accounts empower him and they actually limit him. And as we know, Harappa existed much before, you know, any of those travelers and those travelogues. And they would never, I mean, you know, the importance of a city like Harappa would not be discovered by someone who was always in the company of Buddhist pilgrims. I mean, of course, having said that, yes.
Yeah, I mean, his explanation for his failure to really work out what Harappa was all about was that he was too late. I mean, the first thing he says about Harappa is that 100 miles of the Lahore to Multan railway had been embanked on bricks taken from the Harappan site. So he felt that by the time he went there as Surveyor General and had access to more staff to conduct excavations and explorations, that it was too late, that the place had been completely destroyed. 100 miles of railway track was ballasted by Harappan Indus Valley bricks. So the Vandals had got there before him. I mean, I'm not saying that he didn't really vandalize some sites, I mean, in his attempt to excavate inscriptions and so on, but in the case of Harappa, he was there before he was appointed archaeological surveyor. He'd visited the site and he'd seen it before the railway contractors had come along and removed all the bricks, so he knew what it had been like before. And by the time he had the resources to do something there, it had been, a vast extent had been cleared.
You know, but I think that's an unconvincing explanation. It's an unconvincing explanation because if you think of, you know, the Indian archaeologist Dayaram Sahni, who went and excavated Harappa, how is it that he found so much? And he actually, you know, gave a sense to John Marshall that, look, we are looking here at, you know, at a city which is likely to be, you know, a pre-Mauryan city. But, you know, in defense of Cunningham and, you know, what you're saying, I do agree to some extent with that, because there, you know, Cunningham was only one of the many explorers who couldn't look beyond Buddhist stupas. You know, we've all heard about Rakhaldas Banerjee and the fact that, you know, he's known as the Mohenjo-daro man because he's the person who first ferreted out the marvels of Mohenjo-daro. And not many people know that, in fact, when Banerjee went to Mohenjo-daro in 1922 to excavate it, he went to excavate Buddhist Mohenjo-daro. He was interested in excavating the stupa which is there on the top of the citadel mound. It just so happened that one of his assistants, while excavating a trench below the stupa, found 2 Indus seals. And, you know, by then the significance of the Harappa seals was already somewhat understood. Which, I mean, and that's a question I want to put to you, John. You know, when you look at discoveries and you look at, you know, Buddhist discoveries or the decipherment of scripts, is it individual genius? Is it your intellectual training? Or is it the state of knowledge at that time? I mean, I'm asking you this because James Prinsep figures, you know, quite rightly, you know, in a very major way in your work. And I'm wondering if you could actually, you know, answer some of these questions with reference to the work of Prince Said?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, discovery, any form of discovery, whether it's geographical discovery or historical discovery, first of all, there's a very strong kind of fortuitous element. A luck, being there at the right time, just chancing to stumble upon a particular inscription or finding someone who could point you in the right direction. The process, what we think of these discoveries as being princeps or being Cunningham's or Mackenzie's and so on. But first of all, they were very fortunate. They happened to be in the right place at the right time. They have to have the right people and know the right people who could help them interpret these finds and so on. That's a very important element. The other thing is that very few of them were actually, as I think I said, that were specialists in even historical reconstruction, let alone archaeology. I mean, Cunningham's, most of his work was actually as a numismatist, an expert on ancient coins. Coins and the legends on them and so on was his major field, long before he became archaeological surveyor, and indeed he was still writing on coins till the day he died. And as I said, Buchanan was a naturalist and so on. So there's no particular line of skills that an antiquarian discoverer or an archaeologist was expected to have in those days. But just going back to this question of Buddhism, if I may, I think the reason that people like Cunningham in the 19th century made so much fuss about Buddhism is exactly the same as the reason that Pandit Nehru made so fuss about Buddhism in the middle of the 20th century. In Indian terms, Buddhism is kind of neutral, okay? Neutral. Hindus, Muslims, Buddhism is all right. First of all, there aren't many Buddhists, and secondly, no one's going to object if the government adopts Buddhist symbols and so on. And of course, as we know, in the case of the Ashoka column, there are all sorts of other wonderful kind of moral associations. And the same was true in the 19th century. First of all, I mean, Hindu and Muslim monuments, mosques and places of worship, devotional monuments, anyway, I mean, they didn't welcome the attentions of archaeological surveyors. They had their own means of, most mosques have a waqf endowment, which is funds set aside for the upkeep of the building, and similarly with Brahmins and temples and so on. So they didn't welcome the attentions of archaeological surveyors who came around wanting to inspect any inscriptions and so on. The other thing is, of course, that India in the early 19th century, anyway, British in India in the early 19th century underwent a terrible period of falling under the influence of evangelical Christian proselytization and kind of utilitarian reformist ideas. During the particularly 1820s and 30s, when things like any respect or reverence for Hindu practice or Muslim practice was out, so it would have been very, very difficult for someone like Cunningham to actually get funding for an archaeological survey that was going to concentrate on Hindu or Muslim buildings. But Buddhist buildings, fine, there were no possible objections to that, and that's really how the archaeological survey was set up. I mean, in his proposal for it, he said he particularly wanted to study Buddhist buildings and the Buddhist heritage, and also the other thing he threw in, just to interest the British government, was that he would discover the sites recorded by Alexander the Great when he invaded the Punjab in the 4th century BC. So these were the two sweeteners, if you like, for establishing the archaeological survey: Buddhism and the Greek, the Hellenic influence.
Yeah, talking about the rediscovery of, the Buddhist heritage and monuments and so on, I think, you sort of mentioned this in passing, but maybe we can talk about it, in a little more detail. I mean, when we are, looking at these discoveries, I also think, quite naturally, one should look at what happened to many of these monuments, as they were discovered. Of course, there was a lot of documentation and there were publications, but to begin with, a lot of the monuments were actually compromised, several of them were destroyed before they got to get conserved. And I'm thinking here of Amaravati. Upinder Singh is present here in the audience, and she's actually documented Amaravati very carefully, where she has shown that as the monument was discovered and documented, it was also destroyed, and actually large parts of the monument just disappeared. And as she puts it, in the conclusion of her work on Amaravati, she says that, well, if today you want to see Amaravati, you will either have to go to the British Museum and to the museum in Chennai, or you will have to look through the academic publications. But at the very place where this great, architectural marvel stood, you only have, in her words, this nondescript mound with a few forlorn stones. And, this is incidentally not just true for Amaravati, which looks exactly the way, Upinder Singh has described it. This is also true to some extent for Sanchi. Today I would say that Sanchi is one of the best preserved of all the Buddhist monuments of India. But if you look at the story of its excavation and documentation, it's a very similar story. We've talked about Cunningham. He dug deep into the stupas at Sanchi and he just never repaired them. And that is why even 30 years after what he did, his own countryman, Lepel Griffin, remembered that even 1,000 years of, weather could not destroy what Cunningham managed to actually destroy at the tops of Sanchi within a few years. So archaeologists were not just people who documented, they were also the destroyers of India's Buddhist heritage. And then you have John Marshall, who of course conserves these monuments, and we all know Marshall because of his great volumes on Sanchi. And here I want to specially mention who I think actually, Marshall is important, but the real heroine in the whole story of Sanchi is the Begum of Bhopal. It is Sultan Jahan Begum, this Muslim woman ruler, who actually provides the funds to Marshall. She's the person who makes sure that a very handsome honorarium is given to Alfred Fouché, his collaborator, on the works, his volumes on Sanchi. She sets up the Sanchi Museum, and eventually when those volumes are published, actually it is the Bhopal Darbar which provides the money. So, I actually, like to mention her because if you look at what the British, did with the Begum of Bhopal to begin with, they were actually trying to squeeze her into this very crude kind of religious paradigm where Muslims actually were not capable of looking after anything which was non-Muslim. And she very stoutly defended, her own principality, and by conserving Sanchi in the way she did, I think she showed the British that they just couldn't get their way, and that personal religion actually has very little to do with, the conservation of India's Buddhist heritage.
Yeah, very good. Just on the subject of the Amaravati ratings that are in the British Museum, if anyone ever goes there to see them, insist on seeing them, because they have them in this new gallery which was specially built for them, but it's always locked because they say they can't afford a man to stand on the door and let people in to look at them. So if you do go to see them, do insist on seeing them. Don't just walk away because the gallery is locked. It's always locked. And it's absurd to have these magnificent carvings and then also to have this wonderful gallery for them and yet not to be able to start it. It's totally ridiculous. They'd probably be better off in Chennai with the rest of them.
Joan, I wonder if you mentioned Nehru, and one of the first illustrations in your book is, the Sarnath Lion Capital. And I'm just wondering if, you want to talk about, I think it's time before we open this up to questions to just talk about, about modern India, and I mean not just this kind of, the discovery story and the academic, documentation or the destruction of the monuments, but how Buddhism has actually come to figure in many other kinds of domains.
Yes, I'm always intrigued by the extent to which modern India has kind of adopted Buddhism, considering that there are still comparatively few Buddhists compared with Hindu or Muslims, and considering that the few that there are largely in the Himalayan regions. I think, first of all, as I said, I think one reason is a kind of the neutralism of Buddhism, the fact that it isn't either obviously Hindu or Muslim, and so that you can adopt a Buddhist emblem or symbol without privileging one major community at the expense of the other one. So I think that's still very important. Nevertheless, it is somewhat unusual. I mean, here's India. I mean, certainly, obviously, a secular country, but the national emblem, the chakra, and the lion capital, the lion that stands above it, feature on all the coins and banknotes and government letterheadings and so on. It's a strange choice, and I like to think it's largely ascribable to Pandit Nehru himself, who had a real sense of India's history and was of course a real secularist. But I don't know, I mean today you sometimes wonder when secular values are often being challenged, that it's good to see that these quite neutral symbols are still retained, and I hope they will be. And also, of course, in art and so on. I mean, the bas-reliefs and sculptures and so on of Buddhist India are still very influential and are copied in art schools and so on. And you had some examples too, I think.
Yeah, actually, the symbols that you're talking about really, have a very close connection with Ashoka. And I think it's a pity that, considering the format of our conversation, we can't really talk about Ashoka in detail. But I think Ashoka was very important for Pandit Nehru. You see that in the discovery of India. And I think, therefore, that somebody who is, building a modern nation state, on the back of a Gandhian movement of non-violence, in a sense would identify, with this emperor who was deeply attached to Buddhism. Now that's a story I think, many of us as Indians know. But I think a lesser known story concerns Indian art. If you look at, here we were talking of Nehru and nationalism and so on and so forth, but if you look at the nationalist art movement, take a figure like Abhinendranath Tagore. Abhinendranath Tagore's paintings have a large number of historical figures. For example, Shah Jahan figures in a very prominent way in a series of his paintings. The Buddha figures too. There's a famous painting which Abhinendranath did, which has the Buddha and Sujata under this large banyan tree. But if you ask yourself the question that, well, did they valorize Ashoka in the way in which, for example, Nehru did? It's actually a different story. Abhinendranath did paint a figure who's very important, in the story of Ashoka. That is the figure of his youngest wife, Tishyarakshita. So you have this very famous painting of Tishyarakshita looking at, the Bodhi tree, but he didn't paint Ashoka. The same is true for Nandalal Bose. Nandalal Bose has a wonderful line drawing of Sangamitra, taking the Bodhi tree sapling to Sri Lanka. But Nandalal Bose does not paint Ashoka. And the remembrance of Ashok, you know, within the art tradition of India actually is later. And I would say my favorite of all that I have seen is really the sculpture which was done by Meera Mukherjee. You know, it's an 8 feet high sculpture. It's a metal sculpture, and she did it over 2 years. It used to be in her garden in Kolkata. And she did this in the 1960s. You know, it's a huge figure, so it makes you feel the power of the emperor. But if you look at the face of Ashok, it's actually very anguished, and you can see a kind of transformation. And the sword of Kalinga is turned down. And she actually made this sculpture as a political protest against Naxalite violence. And as it so happened, of course, many years later, when the Maurya Hotel was set up, this sculpture was purchased, you know, by the ITC, and it now stands in Nandiyar Gardens. And of course, there are, you know, many other, you know, paintings and things that one could really talk about. But the point I'm really trying to make is that the artistic remembrance of an iconic figure within Buddhism, you know, is actually much more complex, and for that reason, I think much more interesting than, you know, the story of the co-option of Ashok and Buddhist symbols in the whole, you know, nationalist, that is the political nationalist story.
Yeah.
So I think we have about, you know, 10 or 12 minutes left. I think it would be a good idea to take questions, you know, from the audience.
Hello, sir. Do you think the preservation of Buddhist monuments are done well and are done enough by the archaeological survey at the present times?
At the present time?
Yes.
Yes, I think so. I mean, there's, you know, this debate about whether ancient monuments should be left alone or should be aggressively conserved and so on goes on, or whether there's some things should be moved to a museum or shouldn't, you know. I always regret actually that the Bahut sculpture from Madhya Pradesh, the raining sculptures, were moved to the Indian Museum, but on the other hand, because I don't think they don't display very well in the museum, they're much better under direct sunlight and with shade and so on, shadow. But on the other hand, had they been left where they were, it is quite possible they would have disappeared. So perhaps it was sensible to move them. So I mean, there are all sorts of debates like that. One could argue that they still go on and that certain sites could be handled better and so on. But I mean, considering the number of sites that the Archaeological Survey of India has to look after, it's certainly phenomenal. I think they do an amazing job. I do think the museums, I mean, some of the museums could be greatly improved, but the sites to me are one of the great attractions, appeals of India, and I've been coming to India almost every year for 50 years, and the places I love more than anything are sites like Sanchi.
Thank you, sir.
It was good to hear about history of Buddhism, sculptures and all, but I would think it would have been better if we would have touched upon Buddhism as it's being practiced in India, say at Hanigompa, Tawan, or Dalai Lama. So those are the things which are presently also in practice. So we could have had discussions on that too.
Maybe we could have that at the next literary festival, because in the context of this particular conversation, it was really a question of rediscovering the Buddhist heritage. And when you talk about Buddhism in the Himalayas and so on and so forth, a lot of that, and I disagree with John Keay when he said that Buddhism had practically disappeared. Actually, there were large pockets of Buddhism where it was continuously practiced, not just in the Himalayas, but also in some parts of Bengal, for example, in Sikkim, Darjeeling, and so on and so forth. But anyway,
that to me is Himalayan India. I mean, I was talking about the plains.
Hi, ma'am. I'd like to ask you a question. We have been talking about the fact that, a lot of archaeological excavation, whether it be the Harappa or the Amravati stupas you've been talking about, I think as a question I'd like to ask that the basic principles of archaeology, like the in situ preservation, or whether it's the fact that, if you by chance accidentally happen to come upon a seal or an inscription, which I think Cunningham really overlooked. So I think probably, don't you think so that, when they were trying to come up with India's past, they were probably a little callous with the basic principles of archaeology, whether it be the Amravati stupa or coming up with the Harappan civilization?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. That's absolutely correct. Alexander Cunningham was not ahead of his time, and that is the way, in fact, archaeology was practiced in many parts of the world. But I mean, as an Indian, as a scholar, I look at it in one way, but as an Indian, I do feel furious when I think of Amravati or the Bharut Stoop, and I do think that this idea that Indians were vandals, whether it was zamindars or princely states, I think we really post-independence need to look at this more critically and carefully, because if you are trying to remove a lot of material into museums or taking it away to England, remember it was very much a part of the identity of a colony returned gentleman to carry back many antiquities with him, and Cunningham was very much within that mold, as were several others. So if those are your practices, then you will actually look for a certain justification, and within that all the curiosity and all the progressiveness lies with the Western conqueror, and Indians are either bigots or avaricious, or iconoclasts. I mean, these are, terms which figure in the literature all the time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we take 2 questions at a time? We are running short of time.
Yeah.
2 questions at a time.
Hi, just Nayanjot, following from what you said, and this is addressed to John too. Like the whole controversy about the Elgin marbles and everything, what do you, all that Amravati and everything, do you think they should come back to India? I mean, there's so much of the antiquities that are lying abroad, and I think, there is a downside to it. You would say that they're probably not preserved as well here, but don't you think they belong here?
Well, I can't, certainly in the case of the Amravati Stupa, I can't understand the British Museum having a special gallery for it and actually not allowing people to go and see it. So, I'm sure even if in Madras it wasn't as beautifully presented, at least they wouldn't, I hope, hide it away or prevent people from going to see it. Yes, there are this question of repatriating works of art and works of devotional importance and so on is a very lively field and a very dangerous field. And I'm not in the museums business. I'm a writer, and I don't want to pontificate on it too much. But I think in certain cases, and I think the Elgin marbles is probably another one, I think it would be a good idea. But I don't think you can extrapolate from that a general principle and say that everything must be returned. After all, when we go on holiday, we all acquire souvenirs. Imperialism, colonialism of its nature was acquisitive. A lot of a good, a central source of study of in certain fields is very important and so on. So there are all sorts of considerations.
Sir, can I just add to that very quickly? I agree with what John says. It's not possible to do it for all objects, but certainly it should be done for Amravati. You know, they should all come back. But let me add that many objects that were taken away by our British rulers were actually objects that were worshipped. And that is why, for example, I mean, in something that I wrote, I remember beginning it with what one Brahmin actually asked a Britisher. He said, "Sir, how is it that your countrymen steal our gods?" And, you know, I think that's, you know, that really tells it all. So these are not just souvenirs. Frequently, you know, these have a very deep meaning for the people from whom these objects are taken away.
I think objects of devotional importance. I think even the British Museum occasionally, if it is established that, but I mean, what's devotional? You know, it's a very grey area, and they can wriggle out of it. But I think that they agree that items of particular, not just devotional, but also kind of almost genetic importance should be returned. But it's as I say, it's they don't always abide by their own rules.
Sir, I read India Discovered about 10 years ago as an undergraduate, and the thing right here in the middle, and the thing that struck me about it is the sort of much remarked upon historical amnesia of Indians and India as a country. You know, how did we forget the fact that the Buddha lived here and things like that? I want to fast forward into the present day. This is for both panelists. Do you believe that we're serving our future well by teaching history in a manner that people will remember it, will be drawn to it? Because I feel that the way history is taught today in India, we're going back to a period of historical amnesia, and the people like Nehru who write about the discovery of India will be sort of anachronistic and forgotten very soon, if not already.
I think, I mean, Nayanjot teaches history, so I'm going to ask her to answer that. I was just going to say that it's not just a question of the teaching history. I'm more interested in the writing of history, and I actually think the writing of history is just as important as the history itself, and that history must be well written, and that far too much history is written for other historians or for academic purposes, and it must be written in a more accessible and appealing way. And it can still be authoritative and so on. It doesn't, so that writing, so history writing is important as well. But teaching, I'm not qualified to talk on the teaching of history in India.
Well, I mean, you know, just to start on a lighter note, I want to say, of course, that the enrollment numbers in the university don't show that history is on the decline, but that apart, I mean, I think, you know, what the question you raised is very important, and there are many reasons why students are not interested in history. It could be bad textbooks. It could just be a lack of sensitivity to an education system which actually does not integrate what is around schools. I mean, my son studied for some years in Air Force Bal Bharti School, which is just across the Lodi Gardens, and they were, I mean, it doesn't cost any money, but they weren't taken, you know, across the road to see the Lodi monuments, you know, in that garden. And I also think one of the reasons is, as John Keay mentioned, that a lot of Indian historians, you know, speak to themselves. You know, it's very good in terms of the techniques that are used in terms of research. But I think, as you have in England or you know, in the States, there aren't that many historians here who actually write in a way that makes what they have researched seem exciting, you know, to a larger public. And you know, surely part of your you know, question and your queries come from that, and I do hope, you know, that will change. There are many more people today than there were when I was, you know, in my salad years. So I hope things will improve.
Hello, sir. My question to you is coming back to Buddha now. There have been some sculptures which have shown Buddha dressed up as a Greek god, you know, in a Greek style. So where did that trend come from? I don't understand.
This is what was called the Gandharam school of sculpture, and there's been a debate going on for years, and I don't know what the present state of it is, as to whether the Buddha was first represented as influenced by Hellenistic Greek and Roman sculptures. I mean, as we all know, there were Greek kingdoms in the north of Afghanistan and indeed in the Punjab in the at the sort of very late first millennium BC and early first millennium AD, these Gandhara, called Gandhara sculptures. Gandhara is the same word as Kandahar. They're in a sense Afghan, but the Buddha is represented quite early on in kind of flowing toga-like robes and sets within a kind of within classical pillars or acanthus leaves and pillar capitals and so on. So it's all very kind of Greek-looking. And in the 19th century, a lot of people thought that figure sculpture had actually come from Rome or Greece, from the Greco-Hellenic world to India. But I don't think anyone would maintain that nowadays. But there is some debate about whether the earliest representations of the Buddha were from this Gandhara school, in this classical, or what we call, Roman Greek classical style, or whether in fact he was being represented by a more indigenous style from a similarly earlier period. I mean, obviously before that, Buddha was very the Buddha's presence was very often represented not by a figure at all, but by some item of, by a footprint or by the Bodhi tree or so on. So at what point, perhaps Nayanjot can enlighten us on this, at what point figurative, the Buddha began to be represented as a figure, and whether this figure owed more to this Greco-Hellenistic school or whether to indigenous models.
Well, I think, the Mathura Buddhas are earlier than, the body of Gandhar Buddhas. So, I think it's pretty clear that by the time the Buddha is represented, I mean, he's represented in many ways, and there are, as you mentioned, many representations of the Buddha which use the, classical style. But there are other representations, which do not, and which actually, the antecedents of those you can trace to the representations of the yakshas, some centuries before. I mean, if you look at the large yakshas at Mathura and Vidisha, they're very similar to the representations of the Bodhisattva, the same large, very athletic looking body and, so on and so forth. So, of course, the question that still needs to be, answered is, why are there so many representations of the Buddha, and why is, why do you have so much of the Greco-Roman imprint on, Indian arts, especially when you're looking at, the legacy of invasions and so on? What are the various ways in which that is done? But I think we are, running very short of time. Yeah. There's one other question. Okay.
One last question. How much of our Buddhist heritage has been rediscovered through sources that are non-archaeological and within India? How much of it has come from manuscripts, art, literature and records from outside of India? How important is it?
Actually, for example, and just to give you one example about the importance of manuscripts from other parts, of the subcontinent, let's put it. When James Prinsep read, and he, after deciphering the Brahmi script, he read the Ashokan inscriptions, he was not aware of the identity of Devanam Priya, right? And that was something which was only solved because the Deepavansh was read by George Turnor in Sri Lanka, and that mentioned that Devanam Priya was the grandson of Chandragupta and the own son of Bindusar. So, I think, there is a very important contribution that is made. But talking about non-archaeologists, we are here talking about non-archaeological sources. I just want to use this opportunity to also just, mentioned that a lot of discoveries happen, because of the interests of people who are not actually explorers. The first Ashokan edict in which his name is mentioned, the Maski Rock Edict, it was discovered by a gold mining engineer called Christopher Beeden. The Gavimat inscription was discovered by the Guru of Gavimat, a religious man who drew the attention of the archaeological survey to it. The only in situ Ashokan edict in Delhi, which is near Srinivas Puri, was actually discovered by a road building contractor. He was given the contract to build this main road through that area, and while he was blasting the rocks, he found these inscribed edicts and he actually reported them to the ASI.
I wonder how many inscribed edicts haven't been reported by the road contractor.
True. We'll never know, but I'm sure there are some. So, thank you, John Keay, for a delightful conversation.
Thank you
for all your wonderful questions.